Always worth flagging, this is a super controversial topic. I'm giving you my take on it, but here's the spoilers. I think forms are basically just definitions. I don't think there's anything super mysterious about them. I think forms are definitions. So let's work through what I think is going on in Plato's theory of forms. In general, I think Plato has kind of three basic epistemological categories. There are appearances, how things look in the world, how things appear to your senses. So think about a circle. Think about the circles in your room currently and the things that look circular. What you're getting is an appearance of a circle. That's the first level. At the second level, I think there are things that we can call abstractions. So when you're in a mathematics class and the teacher draws a circle on the board, there's a sense in which you recognize that, this isn't a perfect circle. This isn't the standard for circles. It's an abstraction. It's an abstract representation of all of those circular things that you saw at the level of appearances. So abstractions still have kind of an element at which you're perceiving them with the senses, but it's also clear that you're abstracting. So for example, the fact that your teacher is drawing the circle on the board in black or blue marker, you recognize that that's not relevant to what we're getting at here. What's relevant is the shape, not its color. So that's the second level. It's a level of abstraction. Then there's a level higher than that. The diagrams in some ways allow you to start to formulate what a circle really is, namely the definition of a circle. So what we're doing there is we're working out what all and only circles have in common, or what makes something a circle. If you wanted to get a little bit mystic, you could say it's the essence of a circle. But there's nothing too strange here. It's easy to come up with the definition of the circle. It's a series of points which are equidistant from some central point. And that's what the definition of a circle is. It's nothing especially strange. Now, again, you're not going to get this definition by looking at circular things in the world. You have to think. It's not like you can just walk around and see the definition of a circle. You have to think about it. Similarly, the abstraction is going to help with that. It goes beyond how things are physically, how things appear to the senses, and starts to help the mind kind of move higher, work out what's really special about a circle as opposed to a square or a triangle. But of course, again, the diagram, the abstraction, doesn't give you the definition. It might help, but it doesn't give you the definition. So there are these kind of three stages then. There are how things appear, then there are ways in which we can kind of abstract from the physical world, but still kind of is a midpoint between thinking purely abstractly and just relying on your senses. And then there's the final stage, where you kind of understand what something is fundamentally, its definition, what makes it what it is. So here's a picture of the oracle at Delphi. It's circular. If I said, what shape is it, you would say it's a circle. Of course, it's not a perfect circle, and if you tried to work out what all the circles in the world were just by reference to the Oracle of Delphi, you'd have a tough time. Some circles are much bigger, some circles are much smaller. Here is a random picture of a circle I found on the internet. Now, of course, this is a better circle than the Oracle at Delphi, in the sense that it's more circular. It more captures the important properties that we think make a circle a circle. Of course, you could be a real nitpicker and be like, well, actually, this isn't a perfect circle. You'll notice if you measure it really closely that actually it's more of an ellipse. Now, of course, you'd be annoying if you said that, and you'd be kind of missing the point of drawing an abstraction of a circle on the whiteboard. But there's another sense in which you're actually right. This isn't what a circle is. In some sense, then, it's not a perfect circle. It's not the standard for what makes things circular. And if you were to try to do really complex geometry on this diagram, you'd find that it doesn't have some of the properties that a real circle, a perfect circle, actually has. So on that level, it's still not yet actually what a circle is, it's just an abstraction. More helpful than the appearances in the world, but still less helpful than something like a definition. Here is one definition of a circle. A circle is the curve traced out by a point that moves in a plane so that its distance from a given point is constant. Now, notice something already. This I can't use an image for. Any image that I give you is going to be an imperfect circle. So what you have to do is you have to grasp what a circle is by intellect alone. If you relied on how something looked, you wouldn't actually get a perfect circle, and you wouldn't understand the essence of something to be circular. So you have to move to something beyond how things appear. Now, mathematicians might argue about this definition. They might think that there's something about this definition that's really important to something being circular that this definition doesn't capture. I'm not good enough about mathematics to kind of come up with a really good example. But what's important is that mathematicians aren't going to argue about the definition of a circle by trying to give each other diagrams of increasingly more accurate circles. Rather, they're going to engage in this kind of conceptual enterprise, asking in terms of abstract relations what is most fundamental to something being a circle. Now, a good definition is going to be something that captures all and only instances of that thing. The way we like to say it in philosophy now is it captures the necessary and sufficient conditions of the thing. Now, it's pretty easy to do this with mathematical objects, and I think that's why Plato is so obsessed with mathematics. Mathematics is really the first starting point that's going to be the basis for further kinds of philosophical inquiry. So we can move beyond mathematical objects, though, and think about, for example, what makes all ducks ducks, or what makes all dogs dogs. What is the feature that all and only dogs have? What is the definition of a dog? That's the next step. Now, obviously, dogs are going to be a little bit harder than circles, but it doesn't mean that the project is hopeless, and it's possible that you could come up with definitions for each of the animal species. What Plato wants to do, though, is move to the next step altogether, which is to work out definitions of more abstract qualities. What is the definition of courage? What is the definition of justice? What is the definition of goodness, and what is the definition of beauty? Obviously, these are going to be harder than animals, but there's no reason in principle why you couldn't come up with a definition that will allow you to work out what all and only just things have in common. Now, what some of you might have noticed is that even though you're looking at the definition of a circle or you're looking at the definition of a dog, you're not really thinking about the words so much as what the word represents, the kind of object that it brings to the mind's eye. There's a sense in which you can kind of try to think about what a circle fundamentally is when you think about the definition of a circle that isn't captured by any of the diagrams, but is some other thing. And I think the other thing is just what a form is. When you use intellect alone to work out what a circle is, what the definition of a circle is, what the nature of a circle is, you think about the form of a circle. In the same way, when you think about the definition of justice, what that brings to the mind's eye, what that gets you to grasp with intellect, is what justice fundamentally is, and that's the form of justice. It's what you can see in and understand is in all the other instances of justice once you have the definition. So it's true that Plato thinks the forms are objects, but they're intellectual objects. They're what comes to mind when you think about the correct definition of the thing. And of course, what comes to mind when you think about the definition of a circle is in some ways much clearer than what comes to mind when you try to think about the definition of justice, if you can even come up with one. That's the sense in which Plato thinks that some people are able to see and grasp some forms more easily than others, and the hardest forms to grasp are going to be the most abstract ones, the ones that come very late in education, the form of courage, the form of justice, the form of beauty, and the form of goodness. It's much harder to bring those objects to the mind's eye, and then being able to kind of see and recognize those in all beautiful and good things in the world. Now, a really common misinterpretation of Plato's theory is that there's a world of forms, a realm of forms. Something like Plato's heaven is sometimes a phrase that gets tossed around. But hopefully you can see why this way of thinking is a mistake. If I were to ask you, where is the definition of a circle? It would be just as nonsensical as asking, where is the number 2? It's not anywhere. You understand it through abstraction. You grasp it by intellect. You certainly don't grasp it through the senses. Like I said, you can't see definitions in the world. So I think that's what Plato is getting at when he says that forms are kind of fundamentally separate from the physical world. That's because we can't access forms just through our senses. No amount of empiricism is going to give you the definition of a circle or a triangle. It's only going to give you data from which to abstract. And I think that's the really key insight about Platonic epistemology. It's not that there's some other realm of form somewhere, but there are important things which explain the structure of the world and the objects in the world, often in mathematical forms, mathematical representations. And so what we should be doing is we should be abstracting, we should be thinking, we should be trying to work out what kind of underlies each of the things in the world. But to do that, we can't just go out and investigate. We can't use our senses. We need to use intellect, which abstracts from the world, which enables us to move from the actual physical things to diagrams and representations, to the foundational definitions, which really explain what things are. And that's what I think forms are. Think about the code to a computer game. Somebody might think that a computer game fundamentally is how it appears to the player. But someone who codes games might think that actually what's really the game is the code. Everything else is just kind of appearances. How the code functions depending on the inputs when you actually play it, that's kind of irrelevant. What's really important for understanding the game is understanding its code. I think Plato thinks about the world the same way. We have all these appearances, but what we really want to know is what the code of the world is. What's its basic mathematical structure? How do each of the elements relate? What's the piece of code? What's the definition which makes particular things appear the way that they are? So this is why Plato sometimes talks about forms as having more being or being more true than appearances. No matter how many times I play through a particular computer game, all I'm doing is getting more and more appearances of the game. I'm not understanding the code. Whereas what the game fundamentally is, what explains all of its possibilities, what explains kind of fundamentally how it functions, is its code. In that sense, the code is more strictly speaking the game than the appearances of the game. The code is what the game really is. Alright, at this point, let's try to bring it all back home. Remember, our goal was to make rulers who were genuinely good people and genuinely just people. How does all this weird abstract reasoning and how does all this mathematics contribute to that goal? Now, if you can get this point, hopefully you'll really like the Republic, because I think once you see this, it's really cool. Think back to musical and gymnastic education. The very general point was that you want to be a well-balanced, well-developed individual, who's not too excessive in one respect and not deficient in another. Now notice there's a way of representing this as a kind of proportion. The proportion in music in your life needs to be balanced by the proportion of gymnastics in your life. So we can think about this in kind of like a very easy numerical scale just by thinking about how many hours you dedicate to some particular task. If you spend 4 hours a day working out, that's probably too much. Even the most hardcore exercise people are going to say that, if you're doing 1 to 2 hours a day of really solid exercise, that's probably enough for most people. Music is going to take a little bit longer though. Say you want to become good at the piano. You need to warm up for at least half an hour, and then if you only had another half hour, you could probably only work on one other piece. So music is going to take a little bit longer. It's going to take kind of 2 to 3 hours. But more than that, you start risking injury. And so even people who are training to be performance musicians, you really don't want to be going above kind of 4 hours on most instruments. And certainly people who try to get up to kind of about 6 almost inevitably injure themselves. So in that sense, the correct ratio of gymnastics to music is something like about 1 to 3. An hour of exercise and 3 hours of music. That's probably pretty good. But as you can guess, that doesn't get you your full hours in the day. So that means there's going to be some amount of sleep, some amount of eating, some amount of socializing, some amount of philosophy, and some amount of general work that's going to be part of your life as well. The question then is, what's the ratio of elements in your life that's going to make a good life? It's clear that if you're spending 12 hours a day sleeping, that's probably too much sleep. If you're only spending 2 hours a day sleeping, that's probably not enough sleep. So there must be some way in which we can then represent the right amount of sleeping, the right amount of working, the right amount of philosophy, the right amount of working out, and the right amount of music. So just in the same way that in your harmony classes, you learn which ratios are going to produce harmonious and beautiful sounds, in the very same way, you could work out, using mathematical representation, how it is that the various elements of your life can be made proportionate so that your own life is good and beautiful. That's why I think Plato takes mathematics so seriously. Mathematics teaches us to work out abstract relations and work out which ones are good and which ones produce beauty in the world. So in the same way, if we have a very abstract understanding of what goodness is and what beauty is in its kind of structural form, we can then impose that structure on our own lives. We can work out how the elements of our own lives can form a beautiful whole by having all the elements proportionate. Similarly, we can analyze how someone's life is going wrong by showing how particular elements don't fit that proportion. Maybe they're spending too much time with their friends and not enough time focusing on developing themselves. Similarly, maybe they're spending too much time on working out and not enough time on developing the cultural part of their souls. Or maybe you're just spending too much time sleeping. It's about getting the elements of your life proportionate. And once you start thinking about your own life in terms of proportions, you can then apply the same reasoning to society as a whole. Is one class of citizens in a particular state disproportionately powerful, such that they're not standing in the right ratio with respect to the other people in this society? Think about the economic distribution. Think about how wealth is distributed in this society. Is it distributed in such a way that manifests these proportions of goodness? Or is this society like someone who spends too much time on one area and not enough time on another? That's why I think it is that Plato thinks that the same principles that make a person good make a society good. Ultimately, what it's going to come down to is ensuring that society has a good basic structure, that it manifests the kind of proportions between its parts and manifests a kind of proportion between its functions, so that what results is good, just, beautiful, and harmonious. This is why mathematics is so important. I think what Plato wants to do is ultimately explain all kinds of goodness in terms of a kind of order, a proportion between the parts. And so if you're going to have a good ruler who's able to make the city good as well, they have to understand those proportions. Now, they're going to be very, very abstract, but we can already see this in the ways that people do political science and the ways that people do economics. So much of it is going to be analysis about how it is that various goods are concentrated badly in parts of society, or that other parts are spread out badly in society. What we want to do is get all the parts working together harmoniously so that they're proportionate and contribute to the goodness of a whole, in the same way that the parts of your life should be proportionate so that they contribute to the goodness of your life as a whole. Hopefully you can see now why Plato makes such a big deal about the form of goodness and why it is that the philosophers need to know it. The form of the good is going to be some kind of absolute template that allows you to bring about goodness in your own life and bring about goodness in the city, by which he means bringing about a kind of order so that there's a proportionality between the parts that makes everything work better in it. No, the video is already too long. I don't want to go into it. Read into it what you think is going on, given what we've talked about in these few lectures. I will just finish by saying one thing, though. I think that the reason that the philosopher, after seeing the form of the good, after seeing the sun, goes back into the cave, is because he's understood the template for goodness, and he then wants to bring about that goodness in the world. So you have to return to the cave because that's where you're going to bring about the most benefit. There's no point just knowing what the structure of a good life is and what the structure of a good city is. You want to bring it about. And for that, you have to go back into the cave.